In a quiet suburban neighborhood nestled between rolling hills and tree-lined streets, life moved at a predictable pace. The houses were neat, the lawns perfectly manicured, and the air carried an aura of calm that seemed almost too good to be true. This was Maplewood Estates, a place where everyone knew each other by name, or so it appeared on the surface. But beneath its pristine exterior lay a web of rules, regulations, and petty grievances enforced by the Homeowners Association, HOA, led by none other than Mrs. Evelyn Grayson. Mrs. Grayson was a woman who took pride in her role as HOA president. She wore tailored suits, spoke with authority, and had a knack for making people feel small when they dared to question her decisions. Her clipboard was always in hand, and her sharp eyes missed nothing, whether it was a mailbox painted the wrong shade of beige or a car parked slightly over the designated line. To many residents, she was both feared and respected, though few would admit it openly. Some even joked that she probably dreamed about rule violations. Living among these carefully curated homes was Alex Thompson, a bright and cheerful teenager who loved spending time outdoors riding bikes and playing basketball with friends. Life wasn't perfect, but it was comfortable. Alex's family consisted of his mom, Sarah, who worked as a school counselor, his younger sister, Lily, who adored animals, and their father, Judge Robert Thompson. Known affectionately as Judge Bob by those close to him, he was a man of integrity and wisdom. With decades of experience presiding over court cases, he believed deeply in fairness and justice. Yet despite his stern reputation in the courtroom, at home, he was warm and approachable, often cracking jokes that made everyone laugh. Maplewood Estates had been their dream home when they first moved in 5 years ago. The community promised safety, tranquility, and a sense of belonging. At first, everything seemed idyllic. Neighbors greeted one another warmly, holiday parties brought everyone together, and summer barbecues filled the air with the smell of grilled burgers and laughter. However, over time, cracks began to show. The HOA grew stricter, imposing fines for minor infractions like leaving trash cans out overnight or planting flowers without prior approval. While some families grumbled quietly, most complied without protest, fearing retaliation from Mrs. Grayson. For Alex, life went on much as it always had. School kept him busy during the week, and weekends were reserved for hanging out with friends or helping his dad tinker in the garage. But things changed when his extended family announced plans to visit from out of town. His grandparents, aunt, uncle, and cousins hadn't seen them in 2 years due to conflicting schedules, and the news filled the household with excitement. They talked endlessly about what activities to plan, from picnics in the park to game nights at home. Even Judge Bob, usually reserved, couldn't hide his enthusiasm. He looked forward to introducing his grandchildren to the joys of fishing at the nearby lake. Unbeknownst to them, however, trouble was brewing. Word traveled fast in Maplewood Estates, especially when it came to anything remotely unusual. When Mrs. Grayson caught wind of the upcoming visit, she immediately called an emergency meeting with the HOA board. According to her, large gatherings, even familial ones, posed a risk to the community's harmony. "We can't have strangers wandering around unchecked," she declared dramatically, pounding her fist on the table for emphasis. By the end of the session, they drafted a strict set of guidelines for visitors. Mandatory parking permits, background checks, and even dress codes for guests attending outdoor events. Worst of all, anyone failing to comply would face hefty fines. Or worse, eviction. As the days passed, anticipation turned into unease. Neighbors whispered behind closed doors, speculating about how far Mrs. Grayson would go this time. Would she really ban Alex's family? Surely not. But deep down, the Thompsons couldn't shake the feeling that something unpleasant was coming their way. The morning started like any other, with sunlight streaming through the windows and birds chirping cheerfully outside. Alex sat at the kitchen table munching on cereal while his mom flipped pancakes on the stove. Everything felt normal. Until the doorbell rang. Judge Bob answered it, expecting perhaps a delivery or a neighbor dropping by. Instead, standing on the porch was Mrs. Evelyn Grayson herself, clipboard in hand and a smug expression plastered across her face. Without waiting to be invited inside, She thrust a neatly folded letter toward him. "Good morning, Judge Thompson," she said in her clipped tone. "I trust you'll find this informative." Curious but wary, Judge Bob accepted the envelope and thanked her politely before closing the door. Back in the kitchen, he opened it and scanned the contents silently. As he read, his brow furrowed deeper with each passing sentence. Finally, unable to contain himself, he let out a low whistle. "Well," he muttered under his breath, "this is unbelievable." Alex leaned over eagerly. "What is it, Dad?" His father handed him the letter, which outlined the HOA's new visitor policy in excruciating detail. Parking permits required, 72 hours notice, background checks for every guest, dress codes prohibiting shorts and flip-flops. It sounded more like prison regulations than guidelines for visiting family members. And then there was the kicker. If anyone violated these rules, the HOA reserved the right to impose fines or evict the homeowner entirely. Sarah joined them, reading over Alex's shoulder. Her lips tightened into a thin line. "This has gone too far," she said firmly. "They can't seriously expect us to comply with this nonsense." Determined to resolve the matter peacefully, Judge Bob decided to meet with Mrs. Grayson directly. He called her later that afternoon, requesting a private discussion. Reluctantly, she agreed, though her tone suggested she viewed it as more of a nuisance than an opportunity for compromise. The following day, they sat across from each other in her immaculate living room, surrounded by framed certificates and awards attesting to her years of service to the community. "I understand your concerns," Judge Bob began diplomatically, "but surely we can come to some sort of agreement. These restrictions are excessive and frankly unnecessary." Mrs. Grayson pursed her lips, clearly unimpressed. "Excessive? Unnecessary?" she echoed incredulously. "Judge Thompson, I assure you, these measures are vital for maintaining order and protecting our property values. You wouldn't want your neighbors thinking you're careless, would you?" The conversation quickly devolved into a stalemate. No matter how reasonable Judge Bob's arguments, Mrs. Grayson refused to budge. Frustrated but unwilling to escalate further, he left, the meeting empty-handed. Over the next few days, he tried reaching out to other HOA board members, hoping to sway them to his side. But Mrs. Grayson had anticipated this move and had already secured their loyalty through subtle manipulation and veiled threats. Meanwhile, Alex struggled to focus on schoolwork, distracted by worry about whether his grandparents would actually be allowed to visit. His younger sister, Lily, cried when she heard the news, devastated at the thought of never seeing her favorite cousin again. Tensions mounted within the household as the date of the planned visit drew nearer. Then came the final blow. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, another letter arrived, this time delivered via certified mail. It stated bluntly that Alex's entire family was officially banned from entering Maplewood Estates unless they adhered to the HOA's absurd requirements. Failure to comply would result in immediate legal action. Reading those words felt like a punch to the gut. For the first time, Judge Bob's usually calm demeanor cracked. He clenched his fists, anger simmering beneath the surface. "They've crossed a line," he growled, pacing back and forth in the living room. "Enough is enough." And with that, the stage was set for a showdown unlike anything Maplewood Estates had ever seen. The Thompson household was buzzing with frustration and disbelief. The HOA's letter banning Alex's family from visiting had struck a nerve, not just within their home, but throughout the neighborhood. Word spread quickly among the residents of Maplewood Estates, dividing them into two distinct camps: those who supported the HOA's iron grip and those who sympathized with the Thompsons. For Alex, life became increasingly difficult. At school, whispers followed him in the hallways. Some classmates teased him, calling his house the banned zone, while others offered quiet support. His friends tried to cheer him up, inviting him over for sleepovers or game nights, but it wasn't the same as having his cousins around. Even his favorite basketball games felt less exciting without the playful banter he shared with his older cousin, Jake. At home, the tension was palpable. Judge Bob spent hours on the phone, consulting lawyers and researching legal precedents. Sarah busied herself organizing petitions, reaching out to neighbors and drafting letters to local newspapers. Lily, usually bubbly and carefree, grew quieter, retreating into her room to draw pictures of happier times with her cousins. The once vibrant energy of the Thompson household had dimmed, replaced by an undercurrent of anger and helplessness. Meanwhile, Mrs. Grayson wasted no time capitalizing on the situation. She held impromptu meetings with the HOA board, assuring them that her actions were justified. "We're protecting our community," she declared during one such gathering, her voice dripping with self-righteousness. "If we start bending the rules for one family, where does it end? Chaos, that's what happens." Her rhetoric resonated with some residents, particularly those who valued conformity above all else. A few even began patrolling the streets, keeping an eye out for any signs of unauthorized visitors. Others, however, started questioning the HOA's authority. One neighbor, Mr. Patel, approached Judge Bob after seeing him in the driveway. "I'm sorry about what's happening," Mr. Patel said softly, glancing around to ensure no one was listening. "This isn't right. If there's anything I can do to help, let me know." Judge Bob nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Mr. Patel. We could use all the support we can get." As more neighbors voiced their concerns, cracks began to form in the HOA's facade. But Mrs. Grayson wasn't about to back down. She doubled down on her efforts, sending out newsletters filled with thinly veiled warnings about the dangers of outsiders disrupting the harmony of Maplewood Estates. She even went so far as to install additional security cameras near common areas, claiming they were necessary for community safety. Despite these obstacles, Judge Bob refused to give up. He filed multiple appeals with the HOA, citing violations of basic human decency and fairness. Each appeal was met with rejection, often accompanied by condescending notes from Mrs. Grayson herself. "Your persistence is admirable, Judge Thompson," one letter read, "but ultimately futile. You must learn to respect the rules like everyone else." One evening, tensions reached a boiling point. Mrs. Grayson arrived at the Thompsons' doorstep unannounced, flanked by two uniformed officers. She accused the family of harassment, claiming they had been spreading false information about the HOA. Her tone was icy, her eyes blazing with indignation. "Enough is enough," she snapped. "Either you comply with our policies or you'll face the consequences." Judge Bob stood firm, his voice steady despite the rising fury inside him. "Mrs. Grayson, your behavior is unacceptable. This isn't about rules. It's about people. My family deserves to be treated with dignity and respect." The standoff ended with the officers leaving after finding no evidence of wrongdoing. But the damage was done. The incident only fueled Judge Bob's determination to fight back. Late too. That night, sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by legal documents, he realized something crucial. The HOA's power wasn't absolute. There had to be a way to hold them accountable. The turning point came unexpectedly during a routine HOA meeting. Judge Bob decided to attend, hoping to address the board directly. Armed with folders full of research and notes, he walked into the community center feeling both nervous and resolute. The room was packed with residents, many of whom avoided eye contact as he took his seat near the front. Mrs. Grayson presided, over the meeting, her usual air of superiority and tact. When it was finally his turn to speak, Judge Bob rose slowly, adjusting his tie before addressing the crowd. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his deep voice commanding attention. "I'd like to thank the board for allowing me this opportunity to share my perspective. What we're dealing with here isn't just a disagreement over visitor policies, it's a matter of principle." He went on to explain how the HOA's actions violated fundamental rights to privacy and association. He cited examples of similar cases across the country where homeowners successfully challenged oppressive HOA rules. As he spoke, murmurs rippled through the audience. Some nodded in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Mrs. Grayson listened intently, her expression unreadable. When Judge Bob finished, she stood abruptly, her heels clicking against the floor. "While your arguments are compelling, Judge Thompson," she said coolly, "they fail to consider the greater good of our community. Rules exist for a reason, to maintain order and protect property values. Before she could continue, another resident interrupted, a young mother named Lisa Chen. With all due respect, Mrs. Grayson, when did protecting property values become more important than treating people with kindness? She asked boldly, earning applause from several attendees. Encouraged by Lisa's bravery, others chimed in, sharing stories of their own grievances with the HOA. One man recounted how he was fined for painting his front door red. Another woman described being scolded for planting sunflowers in her garden. The floodgates had opened, and for the first time, Mrs. Grayson looked rattled. After the meeting adjourned, Judge Bob returned home exhausted but hopeful. That night, as he sifted through old case files, he stumbled upon something extraordinary. A clause buried deep within the HOA's charter that explicitly prohibited discrimination based on familial status, a clear violation of county ordinances. It was the ammunition he needed. The next morning, Judge Bob submitted a formal complaint to the county commissioner's office, attaching copies of the incriminating documents. Within days, investigators arrived in Maplewood Estates, interviewing residents and reviewing the HOA's records. Mrs. Grayson fought back fiercely, hiring expensive lawyers and launching smear campaigns against the Thompsons. She accused Judge Bob of abusing his position and attempting to sabotage the community, but the tide was turning. More and more residents came forward, sharing their frustrations with the HOA's heavy-handed tactics. The media picked up the story, casting a spotlight on the battle between individual freedoms and bureaucratic control. Public opinion began to sway in favor of the Thompsons, putting immense pressure on the HOA to reform. As the investigation unfolded, Judge Bob found himself at the center of a growing movement. Neighbors who once feared speaking out now rallied behind him, organizing protests and circulating petitions. For Alex, it was a bittersweet victory. On one hand, he was proud of his dad for standing up to injustice. On the other, he couldn't shake the sadness of knowing how much harm the HOA had caused. Then came the moment of truth. During a televised town hall meeting, Judge Bob confronted Mrs. Grayson head-on. Standing tall in front of a live audience, he exposed years of mismanagement and abuse of power. "You've weaponized fear and intimidation to control this community," he declared, his words ringing with conviction. "But enough is enough. It's time for change." Mrs. Grayson's rebuttal fell flat, her usual confidence crumbling, under the weight of undeniable evidence. By the end of the night, the county announced its decision. The HOA's authority would be suspended pending further review. Cheers erupted from the crowd as residents celebrated the beginning of a new chapter for Maplewood Estates. The suspension of the HOA's authority sent shockwaves through Maplewood Estates. For years, residents had lived under the shadow of Mrs. Grayson's iron-fisted rule, too afraid to speak out or challenge her decisions. But now, with the county stepping in and placing the HOA under review, people began to feel a sense of liberation they hadn't experienced in years. The news spread like wildfire, igniting conversations at grocery stores, parks, and school drop-offs. Some neighbors hugged each other in relief, while others simply shook their heads in disbelief that it had come to this. For Judge Bob Thompson, however, the fight was far from over. While the temporary suspension was a victory, he knew it wasn't enough. He wanted accountability, not just for his family, but for every resident who had suffered under the HOA's oppressive regime. And so, he prepared for what would become the most intense showdown yet, a public hearing before the county commissioners. On the day of the hearing, Maplewood Estates buzzed with anticipation. Residents packed into the county courthouse, filling every seat and lining the walls. Reporters set up cameras and microphones, eager to capture the drama unfolding. Mrs. Grayson arrived flanked by her team of high-priced lawyers, her usual air of superiority masking the cracks in her armor. Judge Bob, accompanied by his family, walked in calmly, his demeanor steady but resolute. As the proceedings began, Mrs. Grayson took the stand first, defending the HOA's actions as necessary for maintaining order. She spoke passionately about protecting property values and ensuring safety within the community. "We are not villains," she insisted, her voice trembling slightly. "We are guardians of this neighborhood's integrity." But when it was Judge Bob's turn to speak, The room fell silent. He approached the podium, adjusting his glasses before addressing the panel of commissioners. "Your Honors," he began, his tone measured yet powerful. "What we're dealing with here is not about aesthetics or rules. It's about fairness and humanity. Families have been torn apart, friendships strained, and lives disrupted because of these draconian policies." He then launched into a detailed presentation, displaying evidence of discriminatory practices, financial mismanagement, and outright bullying by the HOA leadership. Documents revealed how fines were imposed arbitrarily, often targeting vulnerable residents who couldn't afford to fight back. Testimonies from neighbors described how fear of retaliation kept them silent for years. One elderly woman recounted being fined $500 for leaving a welcome mat outside her door, a violation she only learned about after receiving a threatening letter. The final blow came when Judge Bob presented video footage secretly recorded by a neighbor during an HOA meeting. In the clip, Mrs. Grayson could be heard mocking a young couple struggling to pay their dues. "If they can't keep up, maybe they don't belong here," she sneered, unaware she was being recorded. Gasps rippled through the audience as the truth came to light. Mrs. Grayson's composure shattered. Her face turned red as she stammered denials, but the damage was done. Even her own lawyers looked uneasy, exchanging nervous glances. When the commissioners asked her to respond, her answers grew increasingly defensive, further eroding her credibility. By the time Judge Bob concluded his remarks, the tide had turned decisively in favor of the Thompsons and their supporters. As he stepped away from the podium, applause erupted from the crowd, breaking the courtroom's formal silence. It was a moment of vindication, not just for him, but for everyone who had endured years of mistreatment. When the commissioners announced their decision later that afternoon, there was no ambiguity. The HOA's charter would be revoked pending a complete overhaul of its structure and leadership. Furthermore, Mrs. Grayson and several board members were barred from holding any position of authority within the community moving forward. Cheers echoed through the courthouse as residents celebrated the end of an era. In the weeks following the hearing, Maplewood Estates underwent a remarkable transformation. With the HOA temporarily dissolved and new regulations imposed by the county, residents felt a renewed sense of freedom. Lawns that once had to conform to exact specifications now sported wildflowers and quirky decorations. Children played freely in cul-de-sacs without worrying about being scolded for riding bikes outside designated hours. Neighbors greeted one another warmly, unburdened by the fear and resentment that had poisoned relationships for so long. For Alex Thompson, life finally returned to normal, or rather, better than normal. His grandparents, aunt, uncle, and cousins arrived for their long-awaited visit, bringing laughter and joy back into the household. They spent days exploring the neighborhood, fishing at the lake, and hosting impromptu barbecues in the backyard. Even Lily, who had grown withdrawn during the ordeal, blossomed again, chasing butterflies and giggling with her cousins. Judge Bob became a local hero, celebrated not just for standing up to corruption, but for inspiring unity among neighbors. People stopped him on the street to thank him, shaking his hand and sharing stories of how his courage had emboldened them to speak out. Sarah, meanwhile, organized community events aimed at fostering connection and healing old wounds. A summer block party marked the official reopening of Maplewood Estates as a place where kindness mattered more than conformity. Mrs. Grayson, on the other hand, retreated from public life entirely. Rumors swirled about her selling her home and moving out of state, though no one knew for sure. Whatever her fate, she left behind a legacy of infamy, remembered as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power. As autumn leaves began to fall, Maplewood Estates hosted its first annual Unity Day celebration. Residents gathered in the park, sharing food, music, and laughter. Judge Bob gave a heartfelt speech, reminding everyone of the importance of compassion and cooperation. "Rules exist to serve us, not control us," he said, his voice carrying across the crowd. "Let's build a community where everyone feels valued and respected." Alex watched the festivities unfold, feeling a deep sense of pride. For months, he'd carried the weight of uncertainty and frustration, wondering if justice would ever prevail. Now, standing amidst smiling faces and joyful reunions, he realized how much strength he'd gained from the experience. He understood that speaking truth to power wasn't easy, but it was always worth it. That evening, as fireworks lit up the sky, Alex sat on the porch with his dad, reflecting on everything they'd been through. "Do you think things will stay like this?" he asked softly. Judge Bob smiled, gazing out at the glowing horizon. "I hope so," he replied. "But even if challenges arise, remember this. Change starts with people willing to stand up for what's right, and you, my son, are part of that change." With those words, Alex felt a surge of hope. Maplewood Estates wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was a place where love and resilience could overcome even the toughest obstacles. And that, he realized, was something truly special. Months passed, and the ripple effects of Judge Bob Thompson's battle against the HOA continued to spread far beyond Maplewood Estates. The county commissioners, impressed by the evidence presented during the hearing, implemented sweeping reforms aimed at preventing similar abuses of power in other neighborhoods. New regulations required all HOAs to operate transparently, with clear guidelines on how rules were enforced and penalties imposed. Discriminatory practices like those employed by Mrs. Grayson became illegal, punishable by heavy fines or even dissolution of the association. For Maplewood Estates, these changes marked the beginning of a new chapter. Residents formed a temporary advisory committee to oversee community matters until a restructured HOA could be established. This time, however, leadership positions were filled through democratic elections rather than backroom deals. Candidates ran on platforms emphasizing inclusivity, fairness, and collaboration, a stark contrast to the authoritarian style that had defined the previous regime. Judge Bob played an instrumental role in shaping this transition. He volunteered his legal expertise to draft policies ensuring accountability and equity. His efforts earned him invitations to speak at conferences about homeowners' rights, where he shared lessons learned from his experience. "Power unchecked breeds corruption," he often said during these talks. "It's up to us, the people, to hold our leaders accountable and demand justice." The story of Maplewood Estates resonated deeply with communities across the region. Neighbors in nearby subdivisions began questioning their own HOAs, scrutinizing policies that seemed overly restrictive or punitive. Some filed complaints with local authorities, while others organized grassroots movements to challenge oppressive leadership. Inspired by Judge Bob's courage, countless individuals found the strength to stand up for themselves and their families. Back home, life settled into a rhythm that felt refreshingly normal yet profoundly different. Alex noticed subtle but meaningful shifts in the neighborhood. People who once avoided each other now exchanged pleasantries over garden fences. Children raced bicycles down tree-lined streets without fear of reprisal. Even the annual holiday parade returned after years of being canceled due to logistical concerns. Laughter and camaraderie replaced tension and mistrust, creating a sense of belonging that many residents hadn't realized they'd lost. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden hues across the sky, Alex sat on the porch with his dad. They sipped lemonade, watching neighbors stroll past, some walking dogs, others pushing strollers. It was a simple moment, yet it carried profound significance, you know, Alex said thoughtfully, breaking the comfortable silence. "I think I understand why you fought so hard now. It wasn't just about letting Grandpa and Grandma visit, it was about showing everyone that we deserve better." Judge Bob nodded, a proud smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Exactly," he replied. "This whole ordeal wasn't just about us. It was about standing up for what's right, no matter how tough it gets. Sometimes doing the right thing means taking risks, making sacrifices, and facing opposition. But when you see the impact it has, not just on your life but on others' lives, it makes every struggle worth it." Alex mulled over his father's words, realizing how much he'd grown throughout the ordeal. Before, he might have shied away from conflict, preferring to avoid trouble. Now he understood the value of resilience and advocacy. He saw firsthand how one person's actions could inspire change, not just within their immediate circle, but across entire communities. As winter approached, Maplewood Estates prepared for its first unified holiday season in years. Strings of twinkling lights adorned rooftops, wreaths hung proudly on doors, and carolers sang cheerful tunes late into the night. At the center of it all stood the Thompson family, hosting an open house for neighbors to gather, share stories, and celebrate their newfound unity. During the event, Alex found himself chatting with Mr. Patel, whose quiet support had meant so much during the darkest days of the conflict. "You know," Mr. Patel said with a warm smile, "your dad didn't just save your family, he saved all of us. We needed someone brave enough to say enough. And because of him, we've got a second chance to do things right." Alex beamed, feeling a swell of pride for his father and for himself. Though the journey had been difficult, it taught him invaluable lessons about courage, perseverance, and the power of community. He knew challenges would inevitably arise again. Life rarely stayed smooth for long, but he also knew they were stronger together than they ever could be apart. Years later, when Alex looked back on those turbulent times, he remembered them, not with bitterness but with gratitude. The HOA's attempt to ban his family had sparked something extraordinary, a movement toward fairness, compassion, and connection. What started as a personal fight became a beacon of hope for others, proving that even in the face of adversity, ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things. And so, Maplewood Estates thrived, not because it was perfect, but because its residents chose to prioritize kindness over control, empathy over enforcement, and humanity over hierarchy. In the end, it wasn't just a neighborhood, it was a testament to the enduring power of standing up for what's right.